Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after years leading discussions about responsible business in the European Parliament, I lead our discussions about the latest developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, the rise of the Benefit Corporation, or B Corp. Companies certified as meeting high standards of social and environmental performance and who are required to put their mission towards social and stakeholder impact into their articles of association or other governing documents. Increasing numbers of companies are becoming B Corp, and recently the organisation which certifies them globally, B Lab, has established new standards for the companies to comply. To explain all of this, Frankly Speaking welcomes B Lab's Senior Manager Social Standards, Bernard Gouw. Welcome, Bernard.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
And we also welcome founder of natural skincare brand Beauty Kitchen, itself a B Corporation. Good day to you, Joe Chidley.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here.
Great. Now, Bernard, first, there are lots of labels, standards, certifications around, and our Frankly Speaking audience sometimes gets confused by them all. So where does B Corp sit within the sort of landscape of certifications?
Yeah, it's a great way to start because indeed there's so many out there. I can imagine for a lot of consumers in the supermarket, it gets a little bit overwhelming. So consumers might recognize our logo. It's a B with a circle, often on product packaging or websites. We are a certification of companies. So we look at company practices. And behind the certification, there is a standard that is then verified. A few important things. Our standard covers many different themes and topics. So as opposed to focusing on one area, we cover environmental topics, social topics, and governance topics. So it's what we would call holistic. And we do look at company practices. So many standards out there focus only on reporting, and we are what we call a performance standard. So there are elements of what information is the company putting out there to the world, but the vast majority of what we require in our standards, they're actually about changing company practices and improving outcomes for people and planet. We can go into more detail in our discussion. I'll leave it at that for now.
On that though, that governance aspect, that's the thing that's always struck me, that companies are saying we're not just there to make profits, we are there to make profits, but alongside that, we have this social and environmental mission. How important is that?
It's crucial. I mean, what we would say is you can't really do one without doing the other. And that's why in the new standards, which we'll go into in more detail, we have these 7 impact topics, mandatory topics across the so-called E, S, and the G. One of the topics I'm really excited about is purpose and stakeholder governance, which is all about making sure that the company has a clear purpose and engages with stakeholders. I actually did a word count recently, and stakeholder appears in the new standards over 550 times. So doing that, making sure that's embedded into the culture, into the way that the business operates on a daily basis is absolutely essential to making sure that they do something useful in this world.
Now, Joe, you've been running a business for some time, I guess, before you can tell me how you set it up and so on. But did you decide to become a B Corp, and why did you decide? What was going on in your head at the time?
So my background is I'm a chemist, but also professional qualified in HR, and that was my corporate backdrop. And when we were looking to set up our own business, the B Corp handbook had, been around, and I'm a big reader. And I just always felt that there was a different way to do business, and it was never about having the profit element, although the commercial element of any business is very important. But for me, that is just a facilitator to what you can actually achieve. And that's really, for me, having a framework is where the B Corp standards came into play. And we certified back in 2017, so quite early on for the UK. And I just felt it was simpler for our business and everyone that we came into contact with, both as employees within our business, but also the wider supply chain throughout as well. It gave a framework and an easy way to communicate, what we were trying to achieve through business outside of profit.
And you're in the beauty space, and you could have just chosen to have an animal welfare certification, many good ones, or a tropical rainforest certification. You could have become a mutual or a cooperative, but you chose to become a B Corp. So what was it that raised that above the parapet as far as you were concerned?
So we do have other certifications. So we are vegan certified, we are cruelty free certified as well. But for me, it's about that multi-attribute that Bernard was just alluding to. It's about that holistic viewpoint of all aspects of your business and having a framework to be able to culturally talk through that with anyone as your business gets bigger. And also in these days where, a lot of the times as small growing businesses, you use a lot of outsourced, either contract manufacturers in our industry. Yeah, and it was a way of us being able to say, this is how we actually work as an organisation, and we want to be able to work and produce that work throughout the supply chain and have that echo effect that happens. And I think that's one of the key things here about B Corp that's slightly different. Yes, it's about getting the standards, but it's also about how do you then do business with other people and how do you encourage that change in doing business and echo it throughout your industry. We just felt that the movement gave us that framework to do that. And also it was part of something that's relatively new. So the other certifications that we have been around for a long time, and they are pillars within different industries and different requirements. When it comes to B Corp, looking at both bringing together the environmental and social aspect alongside profit, for me, that was just a forward way of future-proofing our business, because really that's the way that all businesses should be run. And most businesses would agree with that. Whether they decide to go through a certification is another matter, but we look at the economics of what's happening in the business world today, and we can see that there's something really wrong if the only thing that you focus in on is profit.
Bernard, this is an important moment in the sort of history of B Corps. They've been going for 20 years plus. I think there's some 10,000 now across the world. I think they started in America, didn't they? But they're crossing the world now. And you've decided to have new standards. Now, again, our audience will be used to hearing about new standards, new models, new tools and mechanisms coming out, and they're a bit confused by all of them. But if we look at specifically your journey in this, why did you decide to undertake a standards review and come forward with new standards, and why are they quite so important?
So you're absolutely right, Richard. Quite a few milestones that we reached recently. So 10,000 B Corps employing over 1 million workers. So we're very proud of that. Now, even though we just reached that milestone, the journey to work on the new standards started over 4 years ago, because we already recognized at the time that the framework that we had built wasn't really fit for purpose anymore. So I'll explain a little bit what the difference is between the current/old system and the new one. In the current/old one, we have many different themes that are covered. So Joe referred to a framework, and that's one of the things a lot of people find beneficial. It's a framework, but when it comes to certification, companies can pick and choose where they get their points. So they could be very strong on social, perhaps less strong on environmental. As long as they reach their 80 points, they can apply for certification, it gets verified. And if they have indeed met those 80 points, they get to use the B Corp certification. Now, what we've recognized is the world has really changed a lot since our founding just shy of 20 years ago. We're dealing with crises, the climate crises, social inequality that's growing. So we need a new set of standards that's more fit for purpose, that reacts better to the crises that we have, but also expectations of consumers, for example. So in the new standards, we're moving away from this point system to 7 mandatory topics across the environmental, social, and governance space that all B Corps have to meet. So this scenario of a company doing really well on environment and less well on social, for example, that won't be possible anymore because, again, all B Corps have to work across those areas.
And Joe, give us a sort of company eye view of all of this. I think you were consulted as part of the standards development, but you're also now having to look to comply with it. What does the changes look like from a company perspective?
So from a company perspective, the way that we look at the certification is very much continuous improvement. And particularly in the beauty space, as with any consumer products, innovation and new product development is a cornerstone of survival within your business practices. And what this does is that it helps that continuous improvement through the new standards. And it means that businesses have to demonstrate, rather than through a scoring point system and just getting to that score, that they're actually demonstrating over a period of time the change in that impact that they're having. And what that does is, in a business, you will always have certain areas that you're much better at and ones that you're not so good at. Yeah, and I think, really looking in at the bits that you're not so good at and to a certain extent being forced to kind of look at those little ugly bits of your business is actually a good thing, because that's really where the opportunity lies. And for me, that's how we face into the standards. It's looking at it from a new product development, an innovative and continuous improvement perspective. And that just helps keep our business healthy.
And if you're willing to do it, can you give an example where you were a bit weaker on the scoring and had to do something about it to meet the new minimum standard? I'm not wishing you to wash your dirty washing in public. On the other hand, I think it's very helpful to other companies listening to see how you've responded to that.
Yeah, so a clear example, particularly in consumer products, is packaging. Yeah, and we know the plethora of media that's going on, particularly with single-use packaging and particularly plastic packaging. It is everywhere. It has entered every part of our culture. And in the beauty industry, it is the #1 go-to way of packaging. In the new standards, what we have to do is we have to think about how do we improve and pull away from that single-use model. And what that has done for us is it's actually created a new part of our business. And we've created a returnable packaging system that's called Reposit. And that returnable packaging system is not just for Beauty Kitchen, it's actually for other consumer products. And we deal with lots of people within the beauty and personal care. So that's actually developed our business in a completely different way and pivoted it that we would never have expected. And it never would have happened had it not been for the new standards. So, it is a bit of a success story, although Reposit ? We're still in those very early stages. But what it's done is it's pulled us away. We don't use single-use packaging at all in our portfolio, but we're also encouraging.
And I think we've got a short interruption from Joe, but Bernard, that was a brilliant example, wasn't it? And I'd like to drill down in many ways on the new standards, but there's too much detail and too little time. But one that I do is risks and negative impacts. The new standards have a different approach to that. It's quite topical in terms of European standards and other standards as well. So it's really interesting to our audience. How do the new standards help companies to assess their risks and negative impacts? And how has that changed?
So there's really a lot changing. I mean, generally, to be honest, in our standards and there's so much changing, but indeed in this space as well. I think we can use human rights as a good example for what this change will look like. So in the new standards, we have many more requirements. And again, these are mandatory requirements looking at how companies address negative impacts. So we actually have a dedicated topic on human rights, which is all about human rights due diligence. And what it'll do is it'll set a much better framework, a foundation to ensure that companies that are B Corp certified are dealing with their negative impacts, whatever those negative impacts may be. Now, a lot of the content on human rights, in fact, the vast majority of the requirements and content on human rights is new to the standard. So this will be an area where we challenge companies and whether it will feel like a bit of a stretch. But it is absolutely needed because in the old standards, old/current, a lot of the approach to risk and dealing with the bad stuff that companies do has grown organically. And I think for a lot of stakeholders felt a little bit ad hoc, felt a little bit like patchwork. There was always, not always, but there was for a long time a lack of clarity on which practices are considered bad and which practices may potentially lead to ineligibility because there were different standards in different places, and it was there was a lack of clarity for B Corp starting or companies aspiring to become B Corps. So again, in the new standards, what we do is we have a much more solid foundation where across human rights and another topic called environmental stewardship and circularity, we have a lot of the foundational work on how companies should be dealing with negative impacts. The due diligence stuff is already there as a foundation. And then we have a few ways in which we try to ensure that particular risky practices are met with heightened due diligence expectations. I'll give you one example. If a company, for example, sells alcohol, we actually have as part of what we call the foundation requirements, what we call a risk tool. There are 14 questions about particularly risky practices. One of those is, does the company sell any product that poses health risks to consumers? Well, alcohol would be an example of that. They would answer yes. And as a result, there are more due diligence requirements that are essentially activated in their the standards that they see. So more requirements apply. And that's our way of matching risky practices with more due diligence expectations.
For example, what are those extra requirements for a beverage, alcohol beverage seller?
So for example, if you have a small company, because of the size, I should take a step back. One of the things that's very unique about our standards is it's highly tailorized. It's tailored to a company's size and it's tailored to company's sector. And this is all about equity, right? We can't treat a small company the same as large. Now, if a company is small, they're not expected to do a so-called human rights saliency assessment. That only kicks in at the medium size. For those less familiar with what that is, that's when a company looks at the human rights issues most at risk of being violated. Now, we don't expect this of most small companies, but if a company, for example, sells vodka and they're small, because they sell vodka and that has known health impacts on consumers, the system then kicks in and says, right, because of this risky practice, you now have to complete a human rights saliency assessment that would otherwise not have been applicable. And you must consider health impacts of selling alcohol on consumers when you do that saliency assessment. So again, that's how we're trying to match risky practices with additional due diligence expectations.
Good example. Joe, apologies for that interruption before, but you're back with us now. And I wanted to ask you about collective action. We heard before about the importance you put on industry-wide practices and echoing through the supply chain you talked about. So this is obviously really important to you, but I think even more you want to say to companies, collective action. Tell us more about what you think about that.
Yeah, so I think, sorry for dropping out there, I don't know what happened. So with the collective action aspect of it, again, this is where, B Corp comes into its own. It's a great way of being able to pull together companies that have similar practices. So if you're already certified as a B Corp, you're coming together in either working groups or coalitions. And the example in our industry is the B Beauty, which is the B Corp Beauty Coalition. And that is businesses that are within the beauty and personal care space. But it's not
I
just
have heard,
brands,
I
it's
have heard the initials BBC before, but carry on.
And what it does is it brings together both small, large, but throughout the supply chain. So it's not just about brands; it's about every aspect of our business. And it means that we can work together towards the new standards and actually support each other in each of these different areas as the new standards develop. The other aspect is that we're coming together under this badge of collective action. And for me, that's what, really drives the change that will happen within the B Corp movement. It's around where you're not an individual, bystander. You're rolling up your sleeves, you're coming together, admitting really the areas that you need to tackle within your particular industry, and creating that blueprint so that nobody is doing it on their own. You're doing it together. And what we've found in the B Corp Beauty Coalition is that echo effect has also transpired over into the industry at large. And that's really what this is about. It's not just around being a B Corp. It's not just around coming together as a coalition within the movement. It's also around how can you support the industry for the changes that they need to make with some of the, very big, particularly environmental and social problems that we're tackling today.
Thank you for that, and I wholly agree, I have to say. And the podcast, frankly speaking, system change where we've been advancing, and I think it's that holistic collective approach which is going to achieve that. Thank you for putting the case. Bernard, what the new standards are going to do is affected by a piece of EU legislation. Stay listening and watching, audience. This is not about yet more arguments about the omnibus. It's about the Empowering Consumers Directive. And I think because of the heat around the omnibus, businesses are not necessarily as aware as they might be about other legislative stuff that's gone on and is going on that does impact. We're not going to do the whole directive here, but the directive does affect what you're doing in terms of the B Corp standards, and it will give a good insight, I think, if you could just explain how and why.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of exciting stuff coming out of the EU. And one of those is the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive. And it definitely affects us, and it definitely affects B Corps. So the intent of the regulation is to tackle misleading practices and to tackle greenwashing. So we spoke at the very beginning about, consumers going to the supermarket and being overwhelmed by the different sustainability claims and sustainability labels. So it's all about making sure that companies are being true to their word, making sure that when we see a label like ours, consumers know, right, there's a substantiated claim behind it. It's not wishy-washy. It's not the company greenwashing or misleading consumers. So there's a lot of the intent of the regulation that we think is great. It massively impacts us because it specifically targets any kind of claim or marketing towards consumers. And as we said, B Corp logos are often on product packaging. So that's consumer facing. So we are very much in the scope of this regulation. So what we've been doing whilst we've been developing the new standards and developing a new verification audit framework, we've been making sure to align with the expectations of these new EU regulations, so that when companies become B Corp certified under the new standards, I'll clarify, they have the comfort of knowing, right, I can comply with the new expectations of the EU. So to give a very clear example, one of the big new expectations is if there is a sustainability logo, then that has to be backed up with third-party verification or third-party audit by a third-party audit firm. Historically, our system has not had that, and we are making a massive transition to make sure we do that. So we will, in the new standards, be working with third-party auditors. And so what that means is, in the future, when we have new companies certifying on the new standards, that'll be verified by a third-party auditor, And that adds a layer of credibility so that companies know when they're communicating with their consumers that that extra layer of credibility not only helps with compliance with the new EU regulation, but also creates trust and improves their relationship with their consumers in a space that, you know, is getting quite tricky to communicate in.
And that third-party verification point, really important for businesses to be aware and understand. Let's deal with some of the criticisms. Bernard first. When Danone became a B Corp, it raised my eyes because I like Danone. I know them and I like them, but it's a massive corporation. And the idea that they're going to put a purpose mission alongside profits genuinely, that's quite a big step. Always before, and I might be wrong actually, but always before, I saw B Corps as a bit like fair trade. So a bit niche, great, really good leaders setting an example, but not ever going to become the mainstream. SK in Korea, I saw, did change their articles of association this way, another big telecommunications company. So suddenly the big boys and girls are getting involved in all of this. Are they tarnishing the brand? Are they able to really uphold the standards? You know, those are some of the questions that are put, Bernard.
Yeah, I can definitely understand where these questions are coming from. And honestly, one of the things I really appreciate about our community is that there is space to have healthy dialogue and criticism and exchange about what is right, what is wrong for our movement. So I think it's absolutely essential that we have these discussions and that we raise these kinds of questions. I think one thing I've personally learned about being in this movement, I've been in this movement now for 4 years, is for the movement to succeed, we need to have diversity. So we spoke before about being 10,000 B Corps. That's across 160 industries and 100 countries, all shapes and sizes. And I should add, even though multinational corporations are often in the headlines, the vast majority of B Corps, over 3/4, are either companies with no workers, so freelancers, micro or small. So we are still very much a movement of smaller companies, but crucially, we have a lot of diversity in that movement, and that diversity is important because when we look at the economy is also diverse. We have
I'm
lots of
sorry
different
to
actors.
interrupt. I agree with everything you said,
Sure.
but can these big corporations really be B Corp? And what effect is that having on your movement?
I mean, absolutely. So I think the way that I see it is imagine one of these companies that we're not used to maybe representing the values, or maybe we think, I wasn't expecting that. Imagine them changing their business practices to align with the values. Imagine the impact that they can have. Now, the tricky thing is, when can such companies be part of the movement, right? That I think for a lot of people is the tricky point is, okay, they haven't shown that they're good enough to join the movement. The reality is that we have our standards. And if they meet the standards, they have shown that they're good enough to at least join the movement. And as Joe mentioned before, we have this element of continuous improvement, particularly in the new standards. So for those companies, the multinational corporations that have been part of our movement, they maybe got in on the new standards, sorry, on the old standards, they're going to have to meet the new ones, and they're committing to a journey of at least 5 years of continuous improvement. And it's not going to be easy. The bar is really being raised on supply chain practices, for example. And I think a lot of, Richard, the companies that come to your mind are probably in the manufacturing and the retail space, where a lot of the things that they haven't been doing well are are related to supply chain practices. There's going to be a massive increase in expectation related to supply chain. So I'm really interested to see how those companies are going to implement the new standards and what impact it's going to have in the next few years. I think, speaking honestly, if we're not seeing the change that we want to see with all kinds of companies, including these multinational corporations, we'll have to look at our standards and we'll have to continue making tweaks so that we can continue seeing those improvements that we want to see.
By the way, SK and Danone, I happen to think are rather good companies. So I'm not saying that in any way to be critical of them. Joe, two high-profile B Corp were reported as withdrawing from B Corp certification earlier this year, one citing Nespresso as being implicated in child labour as the reason. That I put on record that Nespresso deny the claims. And another B Corp, Scrumbles, also stepped away and was quoted as saying the certification had become a, quote, marketing badge rather than a true mark of ethical business. So those are pretty tough words, I think, for your movement. How do you respond?
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's been negative press recently, and particularly people making a stance around why they're leaving the movement or moving on. And of course, that's their choice. But to me, the more important story is the one that we don't hear enough about. And I was thinking about this in the lead up to coming here today, because it would be quite easy for me in particular, being Scottish, to get quite defensive around, why I'm in and other people are not in. But I think it's more around, can we focus in on the thousands of businesses that are staying, that are recertifying and really doubling down, because that's where the energy is. The ones that step away, sometimes they can turn into that kind of heckling bystanders, while the rest of us are kind of rolling our sleeves up and to make progress. Now, it's always tricky, and when the question that you posed to Bernard just before with regards to Danone and some of the other big corporate organisations, does it make me feel quite uncomfortable at times when I see these big organisations coming into the community? But I see that as the opportunity to assimilate. And that's really where, coming back to Bernard's point about the majority in mass within the movement, is those small, innovative, really radically responsible organisations. And it'll always be tricky because businesses will come in and go out. But I think as long as we take the good from that and evolve, then the standards will continue to evolve as well. And so will the community. And diversity and inclusivity has always been what we've been about. So it would go against, being a B Corp if we didn't want to include these large organisations and try to support the change that they are going through.
And it's palpably true that the B Corp numbers and as well as practices are continuously improving. And yet, Bernard, we're in this period of the so-called ESG backlash, when some people say, I don't agree with this, but some people say companies are walking away from their commitments in this field. But because it's palpably true, your companies aren't. What's different about them that is making them double down, making them want to stay the course?
I can see Joe is very excited about answering this question, probably as well. I can probably speak to it from a very, very different angle. So I think, one thing that I personally appreciate about this community is it's mostly a bunch of people who think about business differently. To be clear, our certification is for companies that are for profit. But they're companies that think about profit a little bit differently, and certainly think about stakeholder engagement differently. Think certainly about what is the role of business in the economy differently. And so, yes, there is ESG backlash, but I think there is this commitment to thinking about business differently. And to a large extent, all that backlash is just noise, I think, for a lot of B Corps. It's this feeling of, okay, fine, I wasn't doing it to comply with national regulation. So if national regulation is changing anyway, it doesn't really change things for me because I was doing it for the right reasons anyway. I was doing it to have a positive impact on my workforce, or I was trying to do it to improve the relationship with my suppliers. So to a large extent, I think we're fortunate and privileged to be with the community that we have, that the backlash is not felt as harshly as probably in other circles. Joe, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, our business was always going to be working to these values, irrespective of whether B Corp existed or not. And I think that's the difference, is the majority of us have come together under this framework because we just think that business can be done differently. And it's about the all stakeholders, not just shareholders at the end. I think it's really quite simple. And, I truly believe that. And I think when there's a framework, it just makes it, easier to communicate. And then as you're communicating with other businesses within the supply chain or within a coalition or under a collective action badge, you know that they're already B Corp certified. So they've got that, trust and honesty element to them that, just builds on that foundation.
Well, that's a great way to bring our podcast together. In this podcast, we've heard that the B Corps are holistic. It's a framework for affecting whole industries and whole economies. The emphasis that perhaps distinguishes it is about performance. It's not about reporting and disclosure, that's part of it, but it puts performance first. It's definitely that element of changing governance and making business more about profits is a crucial part of it. The new standards, a historic moment for the B Corp movement, and moving from a sort of points-based system, which perhaps allows bad practices in one area to be covered up by good practices elsewhere, a bit of greenwashing. That's changing. There are now minimum standards that all B Corps have to comply with, and that there's a requirement for continuous improvement. Companies, large as well as small, will change and improve over time. The impact of that EU legislation, third-party verification, is going to be part of this. But Jo, I think when she said once or twice, we're not bystanders, we're actually getting on and doing the job. That's the best response that B Corp have to the criticisms that, of course, will always be around. And she and Bernard talked simply about thinking differently, that business can be done differently, not because of legislation, but for the right reasons. Wow, that's a very huge plus in terms of what I've learned from this podcast. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we have run out of time, but thank you very, very much indeed to Bernard Gouw and to Jo Chidley for joining us. You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Responsible Business podcast from Frank Bold, the European Public Interest Law Firm. Please do give us your feedback, either on the Frank Bold LinkedIn site or through commenting on your podcast provider. I do want to say a big thanks to Bernard and Jo again. Thank you to all our listeners, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.